Well, hello, everyone. John Lockland here. Welcome to this week's forum. Unfortunately, there seems to be a confusion about our guest, Phil Turney. The time differences apparently have got everyone confused. So unfortunately, we don't have our guest. Unless he turns up in the next few minutes, we'll be very happy to hear from him. In the meantime, Peter Lavelle, who I'm very pleased to say joins us. Peter, you've been wanting to have a panel format for some time for the forum. Well, here we are, just the two of us. Jerm will be online in a minute. We were going to discuss the Six-Day War, the 1967 war between Israel and the Arab states, which led to the conquest of the West Bank and Jerusalem, and which also led to the attack on the USS Liberty. But since Phil Turney isn't with us, let's perhaps, Peter, turn our attention to the last week. What a week it was. Harold Wilson said a week is a long time in politics, and I don't think that quotation can have been truer really than many other weeks in history than the last one. I'm actually going on Kevork Almasyan's show in an hour to discuss it, so I'm going to use this moment as a warm-up. I mean, for me, the symbolic moment, and I think a lot of what's happening at the moment is operating at the level of symbolism. Of course, we can talk about, the war, strategic arrangements, NATO, the background, the history, and so on. But I believe I'm a strong believer in symbolism and emotion, unspoken things being sometimes very important in politics. And for me, the absolute definitive moment, not just of the week, but really of our era, was the whatever he is, the chairman of the Munich Security Conference, Christoph Heusgen, breaking down in tears. He broke down in tears. It wasn't. I mean, you can say, as Andrew Tate would, that he's just a wuss and he's an example of feminized, effeminate Europe. But it wasn't the emotion or the fake emotion of an Oscar ceremony. It was literally mental breakdown, wasn't it?
Yes.
I mean, he has literally, that poor man, he literally had an onstage and indeed live mental breakdown. And that's why I say that's why I think it's so important, because it symbolizes what I think is indeed Europe's state right now. Europe is in a state of mental breakdown. Is that how you see it?
And John, what a very fascinating introduction you've given in question. Everybody, did John mention the word Ukraine? He didn't. That is exactly, and that's what makes John's characterization and question so very important, because it's not about Ukraine. I don't know what term we're going to start using, but that Munich Security Conference ended the post-war era. It's over.
Yes.
The post-war era. I don't have a good term to replace it right now. Maybe we'll work on it. But the post-war security and, importantly, cultural consensus is broken down. And the chairman of the Munich Security Conference symbolized that. A man that was absolutely broken. A man and an organization, the Munich Security Conference, NATO, the European Union, they do not understand the reality in which they live right now. They are completely broken. And
I think that their world has collapsed.
Yes, the world, exactly.
Their world has collapsed.
The post-war era is finally over. And Ukraine was one of the catalysts, not the only one, but it was the upfront catalyst. J.D. Vance's speech, which I think was very, very, very good, though there were some very outrageous omissions. We don't have to go into it now, but there were some really outrageous omissions from my perspective. But the gist of it is the cultural consensus it's been so lavishly cultivated and curated. Can everybody? I don't have to remind everyone. USAID and all these other organizations that manufactured this ideological cultural construct, and that is broken. all of the China has been broken. And that security conference told us everything we need to know. Being broken and not knowing where to move forward.
Yeah. And I think, Jan, we've decided, because there's been a confusion about the time. I think Phil Turney was told 8 o'clock, but if he's on the West Coast, it's 7 o'clock. So there's some sort of confusion. So we've decided, if you don't mind, to have the panel that Peter has been calling for. And we're just looking back over the extraordinary events of the last few weeks. And I began by saying that the man from the Munich Security Conference who broke down in tears was a symbol of this, a world falling apart. The other thing that strikes me very much, and again, it's a subject that I'm sensitive to, but I don't have a particular expertise on, and I alluded to it a moment ago when I referenced Andrew Tate, is the again unspoken sexual aspect of world politics at the moment.
It's fake conservatism.
What is?
The Andrew Tate type thing where he tweeted a few days ago about you must have as many kids as possible with as many different women as possible, for example.
Irrespective of the content, the characterization, I think, is apt. Someone else could have said it, and it still is valid.
Yeah, no, I mean, he puts it in a very brutal way and so on. I'm just saying I mentioned his name. Right. But I nonetheless do think, and let me know what you think of this, that you've mentioned, Peter, yes, obviously the J.D. Vance speech and so on. You've mentioned the USAID things which started a little bit before a week ago, but which have been continuing to cascade out during the past week. There's another very important element, which was, of course, Pete Hegseth's very brief statement to the NATO summit in Brussels, which was, of course, about Ukraine specifically, where he said, we won't send troops, and if European troops go, they won't be under NATO, and Ukraine shouldn't be in NATO, etc., etc., etc. But what has struck me about all these things, and again, in the light of Heusgen's mental breakdown or his collapse, is as I say, the sexual dimension. In other words, you have these alpha males from the States, Trump obviously in first place, then Hegseth, then J.D. Vance to some extent, faced with, well, men who cry, men who blub, or a lot of women, because obviously there are very prominent women in the whole Western apparatus.
We have crying men and angry women. Keep going.
That's right. Yes, yes. And that's another reason why I think that the unspoken aspect, again, we can talk about the concrete things as well, but I think there are undercurrents, there are emotional undercurrents. And I think that Europe has now for decades been built on effeminate values. I won't say feminine because I think that they are a caricature, but effeminate values, consensus, peace, a coordination, the round table that we saw them sitting around in the Elysee Palace. Whereas and again, I'm obviously caricaturing, but the masculine, virile politics from that's now coming out from America is, vertical, authoritarian, and virile. And I think that is also, I don't know what you think, but that's something that I'm quite sensitive to. What do you two think about that?
Sure.
It's interesting because you mentioned Trump as being an alpha male, but whenever I think of global leaders in that sort of that sexual, what is the right term? It's not sexual. It's not gender. What is the right descriptor?
Neither John and I are the right people to ask this question.
I think sexual is. You can say sexual, I think, because it's a matter of male or female.
I would always put Putin first.
Yeah, of course.
And then Trump second.
Yeah, definitely Putin. But I think that's one of the reasons why they hate Putin and Erdogan and all these other people.
I mean, in terms of alpha males, I might put Macron's wife third.
No, of course, I agree with you about Putin and so on. But now, as I say, we've got people like that in the White House and in the Trump administration, and I think that just adds another layer to the emotion which this man displayed.
But it's a good thing. It's a good thing, John, because as you rightly pointed out, there is a trajectory. And this whole LGBTQ thing, for example, came out of nowhere in the sort of early 2000s, which makes me believe that it was artificially, implanted into society.
I agree.
And it's part of I believe, a greater agenda to try and homogenize the sexes, to make men think they can be women and women think they can be men, and this sort of egalitarian utopia.
Yeah.
Trump winning has got there are many problems, obviously. But in terms of the culture wars, Trump winning is a great thing because it brings back some pride in the celebration of the differences between male and female. I mean, this is it's something we shouldn't be talking about this in 2025, but here we are.
Yeah, but I mean, from the European, the way the Europeans react is that submissiveness is some kind of virtue. I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me at all. And the whole idea of self-interest, and in this case, your national interest, is, that's supposed to be grimy and dirty. Well, that's nonsense, because everybody else in the world is doing. India. India, you shouldn't be buying Russian energy, and the Indians was like, well, the Europeans became really rich off of cheap Russian energy. Maybe you don't want the energy. We'll do it. Okay. What is it? A value? What values are you talking about? I mean, the whole discourse of European politics is so alien to the rest of the world. I mean, Alistair Crook was visiting Moscow, and I met up with him and his wife. We had a wonderful meal, and at the end of it, I don't know, for some reason, I was getting the bill, and I said, Alistair, I'm done with Europe. I don't want to even talk about it anymore. I mean, I have no comprehension of what these people are about, what they're talking about. I can't even see how it is of value to them. I mean, it's a language I cannot process because I refuse to learn it.
Yes, it's because I think there is an answer, and that is, it's partly what Germ just said. So the LGBT stuff includes a lot of, it's like Alice in Wonderland. Can you believe six different? Can you believe 6 different impossible things before breakfast? So a man cannot become a woman. A man can mutilate his body and take a lot of chemicals, but that doesn't make him a woman. But the belief that that is possible is an extreme form of the unrealism, of the willful unrealism, the rejection of reality, the pretense that you can control and fashion reality, which ultimately is also at the origin of the European project. The European project being, of course, a project of dissolving nationhood, of turning Germans into Europeans, Frenchmen into Europeans, everyone mixed up and so on. It's a very extreme form of the European project itself. Yes, Jam?
So, I mean, just to add to what you're saying, it always sounds as if what we're talking about, when we talk about this kind of stuff, it always appears to be superficial and fickle, but it really isn't, because I think you agree that everything is downstream from culture.
Yes.
And the fact that both Putin and Trump talk about these things in their speeches just shows its importance. For example, here where I am in South Africa, and I guess Africa, sub-Saharan Africa at large, we're still quite patriarchal. I think you might even agree from over there. And I think that's a good thing. Your tradition is still pretty strong. And if you look at the West, you can see, and this includes obviously Europe, you can see the trajectory that's pointing in the wrong direction. And what Yuri Bezmenov said in 1985, I think, when he was interviewed by G. Edward Griffin, former KGB operative, fantastic interview if you haven't seen it. He said that cultural Marxism will destroy America from within. In other words, a single bullet will never need to be fired because Americans will destroy themselves, all because of culture. And that leads to the destruction of all things political.
I agree. On the other hand, the politics is very important. I mean, you can't do everything with politics. And of course, I agree that culture is upstream. And there needs to be, that's by the way, one of FVD's big big missions is to, they've set up a school, they've got a publishing company, they do weekly broadcasts, that we do this weekly broadcast. But the politics is important. What I mean by that is that Trump, of course, as you know, signed very early on, possibly in the first week, his decree saying there are only two genders. Well, Biden, when he took office, on his very first day in office, signed a decree against sexual discrimination, which included a sentence in the first paragraph about how children should not feel intimidated about which bathroom to use. In other words, it was a clear nod to transgenderism. And that was on day one. And as you know, what the incoming president signs on day one is a very important symbolic moment. And then a week or two later, he signed a lot of other stuff and gave instructions to the entire American administration to implement LGBT policies, including, by the way, to departments that literally, like the Department of International Trade and things like that, which, obviously.
But John, a question to you. I mean, is that politics? That's not, in my mind, that's not politics. That's policy. And this is what we've seen in the European Union, is that you not only crowd out politics, there's a famous book, Lenin and the End of Politics, by, I have it behind me right now, Polan was his name, Polan. And the Bolsheviks wanted to destroy politics. Absolutely. and they would be the administration of things, to borrow a phrase from Marx and Engels. But this is exactly the same thing. What Biden did was a policy thing. It's not a political thing.
Yes.
And what we've seen in the West is bifurcating them, is like they're the same thing, but they're not, because one pushes out the other, where we have no politics whatsoever. Okay. And when we have no politics, that is, you submit. And this is what has happened to the European Union. They have no idea what to do, because policy is crowded out political thinking.
Wasn't it ironically Plato who said everything is politics?
Could have been. I actually, the first book I ever wrote was called The Death of Politics, but I didn't know of the book about Lenin. So
no, it's actually a famous, a very a brilliant.
No, all I mean, yes, of course, I agree with you that it's not politics in the noble sense of the word. It's just policy. But nonetheless, it was implemented. These measures were implemented by the American administration and have now been rescinded. That's all I'm saying. That there is. In other words, it's not just autonomous culture. It's also what the state does.
John, Peter, I don't know who to ask. You can either or. Doesn't matter who answers. But here's an interesting question. How much of what we're seeing happening geopolitically now on the global stage is actually politics?
Well, I think exactly what is so remarkable about this last week is the return of politics, at least on the international level.
Absolutely.
I was tempted to comment on it on X, but Marco Rubio posted a fairly straightforward thing saying that Russia and America would bring peace, and I'm sure you've seen the clips where he says we can work together and have a geopolitical partnership and so on. And I wanted to tweet something about this is the return of great powers, because here you have America and Russia meeting together.
John? That's what I've been tweeting the last few days. Yes. Yeah,
exactly. Yes, it is the antithesis of the non-politics, the death of politics, which we have in Europe. You know, when Macron convened his little summit on Monday, you know what they decided? The only thing they decided, they actually argued about the substantial issue of what to do over Ukraine, because Britain said one thing and Germany said another. But they did decide to have a new format for future meetings.
Oh, there you go. Okay, all right, gentlemen, what do I mean? And I'm agreeing with John here. I see the reemergence of politics. I'll give you an easy example, though it'd be incomprehensible to European leaders. If Europe wants to remain relevant and coherent and competitive, then outdo Trump. Go to Moscow yourself. Go there.
I think I saw your tweet on that.
Make you a better deal than this guy.
I think I saw your tweet on that. That was you, wasn't it?
Yeah,
exactly.
But because they live in this. They live in a bubble. They can't comprehend politics in the way that I think the
Absolutely.
three of us would use it. I mean, what would Metternich do? He'd say, "Oh, come on, this is easy. I can
Absolutely.
outmaneuver these guys easy
Absolutely.
because we have so much more contact and
That's right.
context with our neighbor than this country in a different hemisphere." But they
That's right.
are they're incompetent. They can't comprehend that there are other choices, what we would call politics.
Absolutely. No, I think that's dead right. That is dead right. And and indeed, by turning the tables, as Trump has done, by sending these Rubios and Hegseths and so on, he has shown that these things are possible. And that's once again, that explains Huysgen's breakdown, because as you say, Peter, these people have been programmed really, or at least they've programmed themselves. And they are, you're quite right, they're at their deepest level, they are unpolitical.
Yes.
They are unpolitical, and but it's absolutely structural to the whole European project, because the entire European project is based on replacing the government of men by the administration of things. That's why all the European institutions are bureaucratic in the literal sense of the word, because the idea is that you can make politics disappear through administration.
And
so, yes,
it's a good career path. The less politics, the more consensus policy,
yes,
the more you
yes,
move up. And that's why
yes,
the cadre of political leaders in Europe, it's so pathetic. I
yeah,
joke all the time. You can take the prime minister from Lithuania and replace it with the French prime minister, and no one
yeah.
will notice.
That's true. That's a very good line, actually. Maybe
However,
I might steal that from you.
Go ahead.
However, is it just the quiet before the second storm? The first storm, of course, was the COVID era, where we saw a lot of governments just basically abiding by the UN, the central authorities. Now we still have those same central authorities like the UN, the WHO, IPCC, etc. Our own president is a hack job, a lackey of, the World Economic Forum. Is realpolitik really going to last, or is it just a phase?
Well, I think it probably is going to last. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Peter.
I think it is going to last. And Jeremy, I'm really glad that you brought up COVID, because I think it's very germane to this conversation. Because COVID was an organizing idea. That's what it was. It was a offensive. I'm echoing what we heard last week from a brilliant guest. But NATO, European values. I haven't got to security yet, because that's way down the line. Okay, It's our values, our COVID values, our transatlantic values, and that's the organizing idea. And John mentioned Macron's little meeting. I think it was Monday, and they had another one today. Okay,
yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah. So what sitting around the round table, we all have the same values.
Yeah, but hold on.
Hang on. But who has the assets?
Yes.
What do you have? We gave it all away. Denmark, what do you have? Oh, we sent 3 U-Hauls of our World War II era weapons to Ukraine last year. What do you have? And see, this is what they have done to themselves, because they think that because America shares their values, then we're all for one and one for all, and that's why we can rely upon the Americans. Well, they got a rude awakening, okay?
Yes, but
Absolutely.
Peter, one of the issues though about those values, those NATO aligned values, is that it's only great for those who are NATO aligned.
It's only great if you're in the club. Yeah, you're right.
Yes, because for example, we are currently being threatened with sanctions by Trump because of and you're going to find out more about it next week with the guest. Yeah. But I mean, we currently face
it was my
potential
suggestion,
sanctions.
Everybody. Dear viewers, it was my suggestion. I want Jeremy to explain this politics to us, because
because we took Israel to court, as you know, and so I think there's a strong suspicion here that this potential sanction is related to that, because also we're friendly with Russia, your side of the world. We're friendly with China. We're friendly with Iran. and we took Israel to court, and now we face potential sanctions unless we weaken those ties.
Yes,
so,
Jeremy.
So we aren't aligned. We aren't aligned, for example, with those NATO values.
I have some. I'm going to pour some cold water on you right now. Politics is really nasty. Okay, when it comes to the genocide going on in Gaza, yeah, that's politics. Okay, you could talk policy and values and all that. No, I'm an enormous critic of Israel, but Israel is a practitioner of politics.
Yeah.
I also wonder, I don't know what kind of sanctions they have in mind for South Africa, but
it's economic.
I wonder, yes, of course, but I mean, one assumes that the Americans have still got a bit of firepower, particularly against a country like South Africa. But as one of the little coders to this whole collapse of everything in Europe is obviously the spectacular collapse of sanctions, or rather the backfiring of sanctions. We all know that we've known for years that they haven't weakened Russia. They've, on the contrary, weakened Europe and so on. And again, by the way, historically, this is very interesting because the sanctions were originally, sanctions are as old as humanity, but they were brought to the fore at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Woodrow Wilson thought that they were the magic bullet, if you like, and that they would replace actual warfare. And so there are several paragraphs of the Treaty of Versailles which deal with sanctions. And he had some, I've forgotten now the exact phrase, but he had some very flowery phrase to describe sanctions as being a sort of Wunderwaffen, which would make real warfare possible, would make real warfare unnecessary. So the fact that, I'm just wondering, some countries, Cuba, Iran, and so on, they've lived under sanctions for a very long time. So I'm wondering if they are imposed on South Africa, how much difference it will make.
It's a good question. I think the main sanction is the cutting off of aid, which I think is a good idea. I don't think we should be getting aid from the United States.
Yeah.
And that falls under US aid. I suspect that does fall under sanctions, but in a reverse kind of way. So, for example, I'll give you. So here we go. So one of our big funders for ARVs in South Africa is US aid.
ARVs?
I'm sorry, is it USAID or American Aid?
USAID.
USAID, yeah.
Sorry, what are ARVs, John?
Antiretrovirals, so AIDS drugs.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So I actually think it's a good idea to cut that off and I don't know, privatize it or take sovereignty of it. But I suspect that falls under the category of sanctions. So in a weird kind of way, it won't actually affect us, if that makes sense, because but if there's some sort of economic trade, like, I don't know, increased tariffs or something, because Trump loves putting tariffs on everything, maybe that will have a negative effect. I don't know, because tariffs also have a reverse effect on his own country.
To come back to the theme that Peter raised, the end of the return of politics and the end of politics. This is, by the way, also historically immensely important, what's been happening in these last years. We're talking about the last week at the beginning. What I mean is that for decades, for at least 3 decades, and to some extent ever since the end of the Second World War, we've been told that free trade and economic interdependence would bring peace, because because the market is neutral and everyone can agree on their interests and so on. It's a very, very old idea, by the way. There are writers from the 17th century who voiced it. It was famously proposed in 1910 by an English author called Norman Angell, The Great Illusion, The Grand Illusion. And it comes back again and again and again, and obviously then was turbocharged after the end of the Cold War in the 90s with the creation of the World Trade Organization. Well, now it turns out that actually the world economic system, or at least the Western part of it, is not a neutral platform at all. It's a weapon. It's a weapon that can be turned against people that it doesn't like. And so that, again, philosophically, that is extremely arresting. The fact that this supposedly liberating system is actually, in fact, an instrument of economic warfare.
all the more so, John, because, with my small circle of friends here in Moscow, talking about the U.S. and Russia renormalizing diplomatic relations. And, right after Trump's phone call, and people were messaging me left and right, said the ruble just appreciated 10% in the
Yes, I
last
saw that.
hour.
Yeah.
In the last
Yeah.
hour.
Yeah. Yeah.
Money reacts fast, okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
Politicians are less eloquent these days, but money reacts very, very quickly. When Rubio was asked about sanction relief, my wife was asking me about, are we going to get back into the SWIFT system, because she wants to be able to order something from her favorite boutique in Rome, which,
Yeah.
who am I to deny her that? Okay. But I am very, very suspicious. I would like Russia to keep as far away as possible from Western financial centers. Okay. I really, because we've made so much progress in 3 years. I mean,
Sure.
this is just, it's lightning speed seeing the changes, and they are, for the most part, positive. The economy here is red hot. It's
Yeah.
running on all cylinders right now. It's inflation is an issue. That's one of the negative things, but it's going in the right direction. And I just think that, Trump is president now. Hegseth made one speech. As time goes on, I need to feel confidence that anything that is agreed to will be meaningful and will withstand the one a lame duck president in the United States. But sanctions are the weapons of the weak. Okay, and Russia is, in my opinion at least, enormously benefited from them.
Sure.
They did things that they had to do before they considered it, and Russians never make a decision unless they have to. It's part of the culture.
Yeah. No, I know. We're aware of that, and again, I mean, the whole discourse, obviously, about the Russian economy is this is one of the things that one of the many aspects of the collapsing world. If we go back to my original image, the world falling apart. The European leaders are just so incredible. You cannot believe how incompetent they are. So I'm saying that with respect to what you've just said, Peter. They said, many of them said, "Oh, Russia is a war economy. The growth is because the military spending has been cranked up." Well, I don't know whether it is or not, but then in the same breath they say we've got to crank up military spending to 5 or 10% of our GDP or whatever. There's a former British defense minister I've just seen. He was on the television this morning or yesterday, saying that we will have to cut spending on roads and cut health and pensions and all the rest of it in order to increase our defense spending.
Yeah, but John, but doesn't that reinforces what I said earlier?
Yes.
Is that this is an organizing principle. It has nothing to, Russia's not threatening these people at all.
No, I know.
But to be able to maintain their grip on power, you have to maintain this discourse of that the world is falling. The world is falling apart. It's falling apart for you, but not for the rest of us. Okay, and I don't want to be dragged down by it.
That thing of maintaining a discourse, again, is another aspect. That's all they do. That's all they do. They don't do any politics. They don't take any decisions in the real world. All they do is narrative control. And we've been in this situation now for at least since the first Trump presidency, because it was then, I think I mentioned this on the last week's forum, or at least recently, the Propaganda Act, the Countering Foreign Propaganda Act that Barack Obama signed in December 2016 as he was on his way out from the White House. These things, all they do is maintain the narrative, but they can't even do that. That's why I say the world is collapsing so substantially. In other words, the narrative is collapsing not just with respect to reality, but also with respect to the narrative. What I mean by that, let me give you one example. They have been saying for 3 years, as we all know, no talks with Russia, victory on the battlefield, and no talks, no encounter. And anybody like me who was suspected of having any kind of contact with Russia was, that was already bad enough. The Dutch party, Forum for Democracy, has put down several motions in the Dutch parliament. For example, just before European Council summits, encouraging the Dutch government to make a peace proposal at the European level. And the voting, you can see the way the parties voted. Every single of the 15 parties in the Dutch parliament, I think they're 15, apart from Forum for Democracy, voted against that. And now they say, oh, well, there are peace discussions, we have to be there. There's no decision without Europe. And yet these are the same people who refused by voting to even entertain the idea of peace, let alone take part in discussions themselves.
Or another example of the same is that Ukraine must be in NATO. And then in the last few days, that was never on the table. We never said that. I mean, Mark Rutte said that in December, in one of his useless forums that he went to, saying that, it's irreversible and all of this. And then he comes out and says, well, that was never part of this. Okay. I know. They can't even.
Exactly. Well, there are video conversations of him saying all these different things.
I mean, I did my program yesterday, and my guests, we were getting set up, and one of my guests pointed out to me that is something that I tweeted, and I said, people like myself in my circle, we have not changed our position whatsoever. I mean, almost to the point of being repetitively boring, but we've stuck to, well, you could call it a narrative, but a perspective that is well informed by facts on the ground.
Look, what I'm wondering though is, when you talk about all these countries that are on a downward trajectory, do we sometimes ignore the sleeping dragon, which just quietly does its own thing?
China.
Meanwhile, back at the ranch, I mean, if you see what's happening there, the infrastructural development it's
incredible.
It's on a level that none of us can understand.
It's absolutely incredible.
They're not fighting wars.
No. It's. I mean, I've never been to China, so I shouldn't. But I mean, one sees these videos of these extraordinary cities. I give lectures on constitutional law, and when I start to talk about China, I show there are, I think, more than 10 cities in China with more than 10 million inhabitants. And everyone knows, obviously, Peking and Shanghai and so on. But the other 8, nobody is even, I mean, I certainly had not even heard of these places before. And they are bigger than London, bigger than Paris, And obviously, again, to state the obvious, the Chinese growth is continuing and is very much something that's happening now, as far as I understand. But when you look back to whatever it is, 30 or 40 years ago, when it started in the mid-70s, I think economists, historians of economics say that there has never been such an economic growth in the history of economics. That never before in history have so many millions, hundreds of millions of people been lifted out of poverty as they have been in China.
But not just that. Sorry, Peter, but they're going outside. You're talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, what many people don't know is that they're also part of a huge high-speed train network that they are involved in right around the African continent.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, they built lots of trains in China itself, but you're right, they build them elsewhere as well. Absolutely.
Every day I go into the center of the city, and it's just in the last 3 years, the foreign car of choice is a Chinese SUV, and they're everywhere.
Absolutely. And I had that experience when I was
and they're pretty cool looking too. They're nice. Okay. Yeah. And I sent out a few days ago. There was some kind of annual report on car sales in Russia. It's a $50 billion market, and the Chinese have a commanding lead in foreign imports. And I'm sure Western automakers would like to get back into this market, but the Chinese will undercut their price. And
quality.
Chinese are, I may be mistaken on this. I mean, they may be constructing the cars in some parts of Russia because the market is very lucrative and people want these cars. Again, where were the politics there? I mean,
it's just economics.
It's extraordinary that in 3 short years it's like a snap of a finger, and it's like, wow, who owns the car market in this country?
But it's more than that, Peter, because in the end, if they've got a bigger liquid capital behind them, and you're sitting with countries with mega amounts of debt, who do you think actually comes out on top? It's those who've got more liquid capital. And not just that, I don't know if this is true. It's very hard to establish the facts here, but I heard that China possibly has the largest standing army in the world. Now, they don't go attacking people.
Very likely, given their population.
Yeah. Yes. And the thing is, I mean, they have been implementing the sort of the art of war strategy for centuries, which is, have a very thick skin like an elephant in case. So they don't hold back on the military spending.
But if you look at, as my Chinese interlocutors like to tell me, because Westerners like to say the rise of China, and it's a bad thing apparently. And my Chinese interlocutors calmly say, no, Peter, it's the reemergence of China. Okay.
Yeah.
Because as Europe goes into 100 years of humiliation, which is, I don't know how many years into it is, but it will be called the century of humiliation. I don't know if they're going to survive it. I tend to not think so. But the Chinese, if the Han China is not a country; it's a civilization. Russia is not a country; it's a civilization. Okay, Iran isn't a country; it's a civilization, and that's and they have that gives them wherewithal to preserve and to move ahead because they think in civilizational terms. And historically, people went to China. China didn't go to you, and that is reappearing right now. And people are going to them.
Yes, and in 100 years' time, Europe will basically be African. I mean, that's essentially a major problem.
Mm. What do you mean? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
Mass immigration is one of the vectors pointing completely in the wrong direction for Europe's future. Mm. Now that's a policy, but that's a policy issue because people love blaming.
I was just going to say that's a choice. Yeah. That's a choice.
But I mean, people love blaming the immigrants, but the immigrants, you don't see immigrants fleeing to China because China's got a strong policy on that.
In Russia, as they say, you don't want to be without papers. Oh, that would be big trouble.
Yeah.
Big trouble.
Okay. Yeah. No, it's.
John, you're a European. I mean, isn't this a wake-up call? I mean, like I said,
no, I'm afraid it isn't.
I'm done. I'm done with these people. I cannot talk to these people.
But have you read Douglas Murray's book, The Strange Death of Europe?
No,
it's very good.
I haven't. Yeah, I mean, I'm more or less aware. It's a book that came out about 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
About immigration, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah. Is it a wake up? Well, no. I think I've been saying ever since Trump was elected. I can't remember if I said it on the forum that there were 2 scenarios. That one of them is the scenario that Putin mentioned to Tucker Carlson. I think it was to Tucker Carlson, where he said the Europeans will wag their tails and do whatever their American master tells them. And the other scenario, which I have always wanted to draw attention to, and which now I think is the one that will actually play out, is that in fact Europe will double down. The European leaders will double down, and will in fact dissociate themselves from the states and double down on wokeism, on immigration, on political correctness, on green policy, on all the things which are killing Europe off. And when I say double down, I mean we've seen that actually. We've seen it in these meetings. The ones that have taken place in Paris this week. We've seen it in the statements of various French ministers, various media personalities. It's true that in Britain, people are saying, well, we have to preserve the Atlantic Alliance and so on. But in Germany, they are doubling down. The leading conservative party in Germany, which will probably win or at least come first in the elections on Sunday, has said very firmly that they won't ally with the AfD. They won't bring the AfD into government. In other words, they are launching themselves into exactly the policy which France has had now for decades and decades of refusing to ally with the Rassemblement National. So I'm afraid, I think that I've always, as a conservative, I'm skeptical of the idea that the people will wake up. Maybe there's a certain amount of common sense in ordinary people. I'm sure there is, but what does it mean, wake up? It has to be channeled. It has to be led. There has to be some sort of structure. Otherwise, people are just sitting a bit like me,
I know what it means. Away. Can I suggest? Just
a reaction to John right there is what you said reminds me of Erich Honecker in the last days of the DDR. You know, the Soviets, they want perestroika. They're going to let the Warsaw Pact go, but we're gonna continue the line. I mean, and we all know what happened to them. I mean, John. I mean, to extrapolate from what you just said, so we should assume that regime change in Hungary is on the agenda. Canceling other elections are on the agenda. If by doubling down, that would include what I just said.
Definitely, and there are voices going in that direction. But of course, you're right to mention those things, Peter, because it may not work. The Honecker scenario may be the one that comes to pass. I suppose I can't exclude it. I remember, by the way, being behind. I was still at Oxford then, being behind the shoulder of Timothy Garton-Ash, who is now Professor of European Politics at Oxford, at the time when Honecker resigned. And he wrote a lot in the papers, and the papers rang him up to say, what did this mean, and would it change, and was communism over, and so on. And he said, no change. Nothing will happen. Everything will go on as before. And 2 weeks later, or 3 weeks later, the Berlin Wall fell. So here am I saying, yes, nothing is going to change. They're going to double down. Who knows? Maybe it'll be overtaken by events.
Yeah, but right now, Timothy Garton is a perfect example of getting it wrong, and you get promoted.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. The thing is, John, you said earlier, people waking up, and what does it mean? I've been thinking about that also, by the way, for a few months. Like, what does it mean? Because you see that term being used a lot.
Yeah.
And I suspect that it basically means becoming more radicalized, but people don't want to say that because it sounds a bit crazy. Yeah. But I think that is what is required these days for change, for good change. People have to become more radicalized, or shall we say principled, which is because I think that being moderate or moderation is just a gateway to more moderation.
It
doesn't go anywhere.
But again, the system will. By the way, again, this is something that Thierry has talked about this in his speeches about radicalism, and saying that the word radical comes from the word for root, and indeed you have to attack problems at their root. But there are, to go back to the Netherlands, but it's not only, it's just an example, because the same thing happens all over Europe. The system is gearing up to close down associations and even political parties which are suspected of being too radical or extremist or whatever. So the system is still fighting back. People, are going to prison, as we all know, and as J.D. Vance reminded us. So which way will it turn? Yes, they were still going to prison, and in some cases being shot dead in Honecker's Germany, and that collapsed, as Peter has reminded us. So we can't rule anything out. But for the time being, there's no. And you see, and the opposition parties we take France, the Rassemblement National, they are becoming more and more moderate, less and less radical. So it's not a clear picture.
That would mean, though, going back to ground level, to grassroots, and because what can the state do to a lot of people? It can easily target individuals, but it can't target big groups. Then you
but also I don't want to sound like a 1970s lefty here, but I mean, what is the level of political literacy? I mean, I talk to people, and I can talk to communists easier. I really can. They're easy. I comprehend what they say, but with these liberals, they exhaust me.
Yeah.
Because the level of political literacy is so ideal. I call it ideological possession. That they are possessed.
Yeah.
And
populism.
Absolutely.
Populism might be part of our future again.
Well, I think
it might be.
I mean, I want to be intellectually honest here. I mean, a left populism or a right populism. I'm interested in talking to both. Okay, I really am. Okay, because populism is movement. Populism is energy. Okay, and I think that's what's necessary. I mean, what I guess I can't get my head around, responding to John, is that okay, the system is remarkable in protecting itself. Okay, but you start getting negative returns. I mean, you need to put resources into the system for it to function. Okay,
that's correct. If you look at South Africa, a prime example of how the apartheid system, it essentially fell apart because of grassroots movements, and of course, I think there was some sort of political boxing happening higher up. But effectively, you had millions of people just saying no. But it's had a reverse effect, and now we have this ridiculously failed state as a result of that radicalism that occurred in the 80s, and it's flowed over into the year 2025.
Yeah. Well, again, I think that again we hope. I mean, it's a bit like in George Orwell's 1984. He believed, Winston Smith believes, if there is hope, it lies in the proles. And that was his fatal mistake, because the prole was only interested in another pint of beer. And I'm afraid I don't want to be just a naysayer, but I'm skeptical about the notion of people waking up, because people have been conditioned. In Europe, people have been conditioned. That's a little bit.
But then there are examples of success. I mean, Russia is a successful conservative country. People woke up. People,
China too.
I mean, I always find it a bit vexing and humorous when people make the slip of the tongue. The Soviets, they mean the Russians, like the Soviet. It happens still to this day here, but it doesn't ever happen here. People know that was a break. There was an enormous amount of pain and suffering and misery, and the system, if you want to call it, one of the things that energizes it is the memory of we know what we don't want. We remember that, and that energizes the system and gives people optimism. And so there is an awakening here. And it's overwhelmingly positive. The feeling of national pride. When I first moved here, it didn't exist.
Yeah. John, I have a question for you.
It's very encouraging to be reminded of that.
I have a question for you, John.
I'm sorry.
I have a question for you. So I'm listening to you talk, and I do get a bit of a dark sense coming from you. Yeah. When you look down the tunnel, the light at the end, is that a train coming towards us?
And what do you mean, a train coming towards us?
No, is that
there's no light at the end of the tunnel?
Light at the end of the tunnel, or is it a train coming towards us?
Oh, I see. Yes. Well, I tend to think it's certainly
a
just
slow-moving train.
More and more tunnel. Whether it's a train coming to us, I don't know. But
but isn't it interesting how neoliberalism creates this intense apathy? That is one of the features of it. It sucks out politics. It replaces politics with the Oscars or all this frivolous stuff that I've been gone for so long that when I watch American podcasts and all that, I get maybe 50% of the cultural references now, because I'm so happy to be away from that.
Yeah, no, it does. Liberalism has many perverse effects, and it also has the effect of dislocating societies, of making people atomized, and thereby more easily manipulated. So they can be manipulated. You know, we talked about COVID at the beginning of the conversation, but the COVID policy worked by and large. It was obeyed. And similarly, the war policy has been obeyed. The war against Russia, I mean. There haven't been huge, quite the contrary, there haven't been huge protests or outbursts against it. So that is, I'm afraid, a reason why indeed, Jam, you detect a certain darkness coming. I don't want to rule it out. You can't rule out anything in politics or in history. But I'm afraid I think the outlook is pretty bleak.
I do wonder, though, if we are going to be relative, do you think people 500 years ago having this same conversation would be saying the same thing? Because the world looked pretty dark then, I'm sure, and 500 years before that. I wonder if it's consistently, perpetually the same thing.
No, I think there are periods of great optimism in history. I mean, Peter's just referred to it for Russia. I think there are periods of growth and building and optimism and so on. And similarly, there are periods of great despair and decline. You know, the collapse of the Roman Empire is the obvious, much overworked.
But that took centuries, though.
What?
But that took centuries.
Yes. But I mean, we're 80 years after the end of the Second World War. We're more than 100 years after the end of the First World War. The First World War was, you know, the first dose of strychnine for Europe. The Second World War was the second dose of strychnine. Then we've had 80 years of drift and decay, accelerating in the last couple of decades. So, you know, we've already clocked up one century, and now we're into the second one.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
What makes it really sad is that there are, if you take the time and effort, there are alternatives. See, in 500 years ago, Europe just got lucky because the rest of the world was in chaos, fighting each other, collapsing, and these intrepid Europeans with relatively good technology changed the course of human history to this day. But John and I started right before you came on, Germ, is the post-war era is over. It's finally over. And that whole security argument is over. And importantly, we wouldn't have said this a few years ago, the cultural paradigm is disintegrating. What is it? Trump is complaining about straws that you put in your mouth and dissolve. That's what neoliberalism has ended up being, a straw dissolving in your mouth.
Yeah. Well, let's wrap up there. I've really enjoyed this talk. It's a nice format, Peter. Thanks for suggesting it. And by the way, just for our viewers, we've had a message. It came through actually at the beginning of our broadcast from our guest, Phil Turney, saying, "I'm not available today. Something came up. I must take care of it. If you want, I can join in another day." So that it wasn't a confusion about time. It was a cancellation on his part. Peter, Germ, thank you so much. We'll do this format again. All the best. Bye.
All the best. Take care.